This is Stark, and in this video we are looking at Elizabeth and her Parliament. So first of all, let's look at the roles of Parliament, as Parliament was largely seen as a secondary feature of Elizabeth's government. This is because she saw it as necessary for things like legislation and taxation, but she also saw it as evil. But the Parliament in Elizabeth's reign had three main functions. So the first one was legislation, and altogether Elizabethan Parliament passed 438 acts. And the most important acts related to religion, so this is things like the Act of Supremacy and Uniformity in 1559, and the social policy, so the Acts of 1598 and 1601, which addressed poor relief. Parliament was also used to grant taxation, so the most important function of Parliament was to grant taxation because all but two of her 13 parliamentary sessions asked for extraordinary revenue. And Elizabeth had to frequently resort to levy extraordinary revenue to pay for the Crown's normal expenditure because the level of her ordinary revenue had fallen in real terms, and real terms is after inflation had been taken into account. Finally, it was used to give advice, but Elizabeth gave little interest in listening to the advice of MPs, especially when it fell within the royal prerogative. On the other hand, Parliament gave useful opportunities to the Privy Council to test their ideas and discover the opinions of a political nation. Therefore, Parliament served as a useful means of communication between councillors and those who administered the localities on their behalf. So now let's look at how Elizabeth managed Parliament, because Privy Councillors were often the men who managed Parliament, and they often introduced the bills and outlined the Crown's priorities. So William Cecil was also extremely influential in preparing the Crown's legislative programme, where he was assisted by Sir Francis Knollys and Sir Christopher Hatton from 1576. So there were times when Parliament aggravated Elizabeth, however, and significant occasions included 1563 and 1566 when the House of Commons brought up the issue of marriage, and Elizabeth deemed this matter to be one of her prerogatives. Elizabeth also refused to give royal assent to over 60 bills. But by 1590, traditional methods of parliamentary management started to have less success. So for example, the Crown urged Archbishop Whitgift to pass a punitive act against sectaries, and that was Protestants who had rejected the royal supremacy. But this was openly opposed by some MPs like Walter Raleigh, and one of Burghley's associates made a common speech criticising Whitgift. Elizabeth took this as personal criticism and she barred the politician. Elizabeth also imprisoned Peter Wentworth in 1593 for arguing for a named successor to Elizabeth, and Wentworth had already been imprisoned in 1576 for demanding more freedom of speech within Parliament, especially in matters of religion. So he had even criticised the Queen by saying it is a dangerous thing to entreat and abuse his or her nobility and people, as Her Majesty did at the last Parliament. But the relationship between Parliament and Elizabeth completely broke down in 1601 over the issue of monopolies. And on this occasion, the Crown's officers lost control of the House of Commons, and this was exacerbated because Robert Cecil was inept as a parliamentary manager and had fewer resources than his father. So now let's explore the growing conflict between Elizabeth and Parliament, as throughout the reign of Elizabeth there was significant evidence to show that the conflict was brewing between Elizabeth and her Parliament, and these included many facts. So firstly, Elizabeth became annoyed with Parliament due to their obsession about her marriage and the succession, and this was often advocated by Cecil and other members of the council. But she viewed both of these matters as her royal prerogative and that Parliament should have no influence in it. So in 1563, Cecil had drafted a bill which meant that in the event of a queen's death without a succession, England would become an aristocracy, and it would be the responsibility of Parliament to elect a new monarch. This idea was never put forward for discussion, however, probably because Cecil knew that Elizabeth would reject it. Parliament was also happy to discuss the religion of a country, despite strict instructions that this was not to happen. And in 1586, the Commons introduced several bills to curb the power of bishops. So as a result, Elizabeth sent a message to Parliament warning them not to meddle in religious affairs. And she commanded the Speaker to see that no bills concerning reform in ecclesiastical cases be exhibited. However, the Commons refused to submit, and they issued a petition to abolish all existing laws that concerned ecclesiastical government. so this meant that a few Presbyterian MPs were arrested as a result. In 1563 to 1566, a Puritan party, who have been referred to as the Puritan Choir, also emerged within Parliament, and this Puritan choir was around 40 MPs who challenged Elizabeth's religious legislation. However, this choir was not a united group, and they failed to bring about any significant reform. In 1586, Parliament also asserted its right in the result of the Norfolk election, despite the fact that this was usually the right of a Lord Chancellor. So after a possibly rigged election for knights in the Shire of Norfolk, the Privy Council had ordered the issue of a new writ, and the matter was raised when the House of Commons met, and despite the fact that the Queen told them not to interfere, they decided for the first election. But seeing as the Chancellor had independently come to the same decision, the Commons had essentially set a precedent that they had a right in deciding disputed elections, despite the fact that Elizabeth had not wanted to extend this privilege. Elizabeth also summoned Parliament in 1593 to grant her money for the impending War of Spain, and at this Parliament, MPs made a speech for freedom of speech and liberty from arrest. Whilst Elizabeth recognised that the MP should have freedom of speech relating to legislation, she also said that this didn't extend beyond this. So she said, wit and speech were calculated to do harm, and their liberty of speech extended no further than A or no. So the Commons defied her attempts to silence discussion by framing a petition that she should settle the question of the royal succession. Elizabeth responded by sending the two responsible to the Fleet prison. Then finally in 1601 there was a subdued atmosphere in the air, and MPs refused to grant Elizabeth additional taxes for the war against Spain unless she withdrew many of her licenses for monopolies. The Queen resolved this crisis by ensuring the Speaker that she would reform the process on monopolies, some would be repealed and some would be suspended. However, there is also evidence to show a lack of conflict, though they claim that opposition to the monarch in Parliament was infrequent and disunited, and that they never posed a threat to the Queen's authority. So such events like this include the fact that Elizabeth devoted much energy into making sure that the House of Commons was packed with supporters of the Crown, and this was because Elizabeth created 62 new borough seats. Parliament was also only used 13 times throughout Elizabeth's reign, and this meant that the majority of the time Elizabeth could rule through the Privy Council without need for parliamentary legislation. Elizabeth had significant control within Parliament as well, so for example, her ministers Sir Francis Knollys and Sir Christopher Hatton sat in Parliament, and the Speaker himself was chosen by the Sovereign. So this, and the fact that Elizabeth was able to curb discontent with her gracious speeches or selective imprisonment, meant that Elizabeth had the main control within Parliament. The Commons was also an important training ground for future Privy Councillors, and on nearly every occasion Elizabeth was granted the money that she asked for, so most of her parliaments were summoned with this intention. So finally, let's just look briefly at Elizabeth's golden speech of 1601. As in Elizabeth's last ever parliament, there were significant issues relating to the matter of taxation, and this was due to Mountjoy's campaign within Ireland, which was proving extremely expensive. But Elizabeth eventually received the subsidy that she had asked for, yet it had caused much bad temper within Parliament. The other contentious issue was monopolies because of the grief that they had caused, so Elizabeth was able to solve the situation by promising that she would reform the procedure on monopolies as we talked about before. However, her Parliament of 1601 was known for Elizabeth's masterly performance in her golden speech, and this drew a veil over the poor relations which had occurred over this particular parliamentary session and over the previous poor parliamentary sessions. And as it was to be Elizabeth's last parliamentary speech, she also praised the Parliament for their work, and at the end of the session, it was reported that many of the councillors came out crying. So thank you for watching this video, and see you soon. Bye.